Fantastic. Great. Okay. Welcome everybody to our EEO-1 webinar on disclosure trends. And this is going to be a bit more of like a fireside chat. We're going to chat. We really encourage you to throw your questions into the chat below. I'll be moderating that along the way. And then of course, if you prefer to speak in person, we have the raised hand function. Super easy to use. You could find that under reactions and raised hand, and I'll make sure to call you out to ask your question. Okay. Besides that, yeah, I see some folks coming in. Thank you so much for posting. John Hand, Professor John Hand. Nice. Chapel Hill. Nice. Marmite. Excellent. Never had it myself, but
I would strongly recommend it. It is delicious.
That is so great. That is so great. Can't wait. I love a good spread. Maya from Chicago. Great. We have some more folks trickling in here. Welcome, Maya. Cheese curds. Love a good Midwestern food. Love a good cheese curd. Fried cheese curds. Those are exceptional. Excellent. Jackson, New York. Yolof. Am I saying that right? Yolof? Rice? That sounds great. Lucas, Boston. Hey, Lucas. How you doing? Clam chowder. Fantastic. Amber, New York City. Can't beat New York pizza unless it's Detroit pizza. Personal opinion. Paul Ledger. Great. Laggerty, sorry. Okay, we're going to let some other folks trickle in. Thank you all for dialing in. I'm just going to give a quick intro for those of you who don't know. Diverse IQ, we help stakeholders make better data-informed decisions. We all know that the social data space, it's really, social data is hard to come by these days. It's nearly impossible to normalize. And the space of DEI and ESG is still somewhat nascent and ill-defined and ill-regulated as well. So we solve that by providing the most comprehensive, transparent, and trusted data set for public company DEI and human capital data. I'm here to intro Josh Raymer, our CEO. Josh is the co-founder and CEO of Diverse IQ. In that role, he furthers the company's vision to help stakeholders make better data-informed decisions and build more diverse, equitable, and inclusive organizations. Prior to founding Diverse IQ, Josh founded Retail Sales, a retail industry benchmarking product that he sold to the market research firm eMarketer. Josh then remained with eMarketer as the company's vice president of product until the sale of the company to the German publishing house, Axel Springer. Before that, Josh spent the first half of his career at Wall Street investment banks, where he built systems and processes to help count the beans more efficiently. Josh lives in New Jersey, suburbs with his wife and his 2 daughters. Excellent. Gonna let a couple more folks in. Josh, welcome and thank you for hosting us today.
Thank you, Dan. Good to be here.
Fantastic. And we'll have more folks trickle in here, but Josh, why don't you take it away? We're going to start with a little presentation. Feel free to ask your questions, and afterward, we'll open it up to more of a breakout room Q&A style. Okay?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So we're talking about EEO-1, which is the intersectional workforce disclosure form that every private company with at least 100 employees or federal contractor with at least 50 employees is required to file with the federal government, and has been that way for almost 60 years now, since 1964. And it's up until very recently, it was anonymous. Companies would file it with the government. The information would be made public in aggregate form by sector and by state and by city, and broken down in a lot of different ways. But it was in aggregate form. About 2013, 2014, there was some pressure from journalists, and mainly focused on tech firms, making that data public. especially after the Black Lives Matter protests in 2014. And there was about 20 or 25 big tech firms which started making this data available. Google, at the time Facebook, Amazon started making it available. And it was, mainly, the journalists were shining a light on how white and the male-dominated the companies were in Silicon Valley. And it was really after the George Floyd murder in 2020 where the pressure started to build for a lot of other big companies to start making this public. And so if we look at the start of 2020, in the S&P 500, there was about 6% of companies made this public, and the Russell 1000, it was under 4%. And it started with a couple of big asset owners, the New York City Comptroller's Office, some other state comptrollers, Calvert Research, which has been involved in sustainable investing and research since the 70s, started pushing the S&P 100 to disclose. Some big activist nonprofit organizations like As You Sow started to push for this and file shareholder proposals, and we started to see momentum build. And then the big asset managers got involved, State Street and BlackRock, the big proxy advisors started pushing for it. And you could just see how things have changed in a few years. Now, 95% of the S&P 100 make this public, and I think 2 more have promised to do so this year. Nearly 3/4 of the S&P 500, and almost 44% of the Russell 1000. And I think the focus has mainly been on the biggest 500 companies from the big stakeholders, and I think that's going to start to expand to other companies as well. And it's become kind of the expectation that large companies make this available. And the other interesting thing that's happened pretty recently was there was a Freedom of Information request from a journalist at Reveal, the Center for Investigative Journalism, which has been writing about this for years. In 2016, they made a FOIA request, and they actually got data from several hundred tech companies, and they wrote a bunch of articles about it. They didn't make the raw data available, but they had access to it, and they wrote about it. And they filed a Freedom of Information request for all federal contractors, which there's over 20,000 of them, that file EEO-1s, to have that data made public. It was percolating through the courts. The court ruled in their favor several times, and finally the government said they were going to release it, but they allowed the contractors to opt out of public release and make an argument with a few different cases. And actually, the data was released in April for 19,000 companies for the years 2016 to 2020. So just to, we're only looking at public companies here, but just to show you how much that changed things. So companies that have disclosed overall, roughly 500 public companies have disclosed. And after this release, as well as another release, over 1,000 companies, the data is now available. So it more than doubled the number of companies that we have access to this data for. And because it's a lot of historical data, we had just over 1,000 reports for those 500 companies, and now there's over 4,000 years of data. So more than quadrupled the available data set, or roughly quadrupled. The other thing that happened is Illinois passed a law that went into effect this year, where companies that file an EEO-1 with the government and have some threshold of a presence in Illinois have to file their EEO-1 with Illinois, and it actually gets made public as well. So we've seen about 50 or 60 public companies where the data was made available there as well. There's several pending bills in other states that are along the same lines. There's several bills going through Congress as well. Yeah, just a huge change in terms of expectations of what companies are expected to disclose and the amount of data available out there, as you can see, Dan. And just to
It's fantastic.
show you what that looks like in terms of sectors. So S&P 500, with just companies disclosing 74% we have coverage for, and with all this new data, it's almost 82%. And there's some sectors which, like industrials, industrials, consumer discretionary. Actually, it's more apparent in the Russell 1000. There's some sectors in the Russell 1000, like industrials, only 37% disclosed, but now we have access to almost 60%. Same thing with consumer communication services. So anyway, this is given us access to a lot more data, which is great. The other thing that was interesting is there was about 4,000 federal contractors that objected to their data being made available to the public, and that included a lot of companies that actually disclosed the data. So it's strange. It might be they don't want more historical data being published. It might be there's competing groups within the company, like a legal team that doesn't want it being made public. But my guess is that it's also setting a precedent. Now that the courts have said this data should be available to the public, I think the expectation is going forward, Reveal or other journalism organizations are going to file these requests, or the government is just going to start making it public every year on an ongoing basis based on this ruling. So really interesting. And EEO-1, there's some drawbacks to it. There's race and ethnicity categories that are a little bit archaic that the census uses, and the Office of Management and Budget established over 20 years ago, and I think those will probably be updated to be a little bit more inclusive over the next few years. It's still gender binary. I think that will move towards including non-binary and other genders in the next few years. It's also, there's been a lot of talk about including veteran status, disability status, sexual orientation, and I think some of those may be included in the next few years. But it's the best thing we have in light of a lack of standardization of the way this information is reported, to be able to compare companies across industries and geographies and know that it's relatively consistent and normalized over time. There are opportunities for companies to make some decisions which can make it hard to compare companies. Like some companies will put 10 to 50 people at the top executive level, and other companies will put several thousand. So there's wiggle room in terms of how companies classify people, but it still presents the best way to look at the makeup of these companies over time.
Josh, we have a couple questions in the chat here. Julie just asked, and Julie, feel free to also come off mute if you'd like to ask or provide a little bit more context. Please share what is actually being disclosed, and is there a process to requesting the data, or will the data be posted for the public to view?
What is being disclosed? I'm sorry, from the companies themselves or from the government?
Julie, do you want to provide a little bit more context to that?
Yeah, let me come off mute. We're up here. All right. Yeah, I'm trying to. I guess I want to know. Can you see me? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's not working. It's not working. Okay, let me start the video. Yeah. So what I was trying to find out is what exactly is being shared. You're talking about EEO-1 data from 2020 or 2016 to 2020. What from those reports is going to be shared? What is going to be available to the public? And exactly, does the public have to request the data, or is it going to be placed somewhere they could just go look it up and there it is?
Good question. No, I'll share what is actually being published. So so on the OFCCP website, which is a Department of Labor agency, there is there's a few data sets. I'm going to pick the biggest one, which has the bulk of the data, with the raw information in a spreadsheet that's available on the site. So this is what it looks like. Company name, address, et cetera, and then these are the codes for different groups. So AIAN, I believe, is a American Indian or Alaskan Native, female, and one is a job category that I think is the top level category. So they have 0 people in that category. So there's, I think, sorry, let me just hide these. There are 204 different individual categories, so broken down into gender, race, ethnicity, and job categories. So this is actually what they're sharing, the raw information. I will just, it's basically the same information that's in, just looking at actual.
So you went to their site, Josh?
So this is what it's being taken from. So this is a visual look at a report showing job categories, gender and race and ethnicity. And so the same information that's available in like, this is what companies usually make public and post on their sites. And this is what the government is actually providing. So this file has.
Josh, would you mind sharing that link in the chat here for folks?
Yes, of course.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's what I needed. You did.
You got it.
I'll share a couple of links. So this is the.
And we'll make sure we'll send out a little debrief after the webinar. We'll include these links in that as well, just for folks for reference. And we do have another question from Ron Deep, but Josh, were you going to share one more thing on that?
And the Illinois site, I'll send the link to that too. It's just those PDF reports that's being posted. But no, that's it.
Great. Thank you, Julie. That was great. And Ron Deep, you had asked, hello, I'm curious to know any approximation on how many companies outside of these public companies file and or disclose this information. For example, SMBs, small, medium-sized businesses that employ 100 to 1,000 employees. Thanks.
There are, a handful of organizations that have made this available to the public, but mostly it was, if they weren't public companies, it was large organizations. This was really, with this government data dump, it was the first time that we've seen data for any company outside, kind of a large public company that I'm aware of. This is really, I don't know of another source of information for those small and medium businesses or non-public companies.
If anyone on this call does, please throw that in the chat. We'd be happy to hear about that. Josh, I do have a question for you about these trends that we're seeing in influencing companies to disclose. Who do you believe is the most influential in holding companies accountable? Do you believe it's the government entities, states, nonprofits, or do you think it's our institutional investors?
I think it's a combination. It's been interesting to see, not just with the EEO-1, but if we take board diversity disclosures. A few years ago, public companies, the most they would say about their board is maybe we have 3 women or we have 30% women. The only thing that's required for them to report is the ages of board members. So there's certainly been the same stakeholders that were pushing for EEO-1. We're pushing for more granular breakdowns of demographic characteristics of board members, gender, race, ethnicity, other self-ID characteristics, nationality or citizenship. California passed a couple of bills in the last few years, which pushed for not just disclosure of that information, but actually mandated a threshold of percentage of women or a number of women and a number of people from underrepresented communities. NASDAQ now requires NASDAQ listed firms to disclose the makeup of their board, as well as recommends hitting certain levels of representation. Illinois, along with their EEO-1 filings, also has board representation disclosure requirements. So, one of the California bills was actually struck down. The other one is still going through the courts. The NASDAQ requirement is being challenged in court, but it's kind of set the expectation between those bills and what NASDAQ is asking for and what investors are asking for, that companies actually disclose a lot more about the makeup of their board. So now more than 50% of the S&P 500 actually discloses the race and ethnicity and gender of each individual director. And that's up from like 4% that disclosed the individual race and ethnicity of each director a few years ago. So I think it's a combination of big investors, activist organizations which have been focused on this, that have been filing shareholder proposals. Shareholder proposals have gotten more higher vote counts if they haven't passed, with support from some of those bigger investors, proxy advisors, and again, some of these state bills and laws, and you know, even though that, you know, the New York Stock Exchange doesn't require the same as NASDAQ, a lot of those nice listed firms have actually started to incorporate that same board diversity reporting grid that the NASDAQ recommends. It's kind of become table stakes for the large companies.
Cool. One more question here. Oh, two more. Thank you, Amber. Number one, since the court ruled in favor that the government releases these reports, do you know when the companies have to make their EEO-1 reports public?
So they had until there were several extensions, but there was a deadline of, I think it was April 1st, to either say they don't object to it being made public, and if not, it was made public. So it was made public for 19,000 companies. That's what's included in that release. And I think there was about 4,000 that objected to it, to the release. And the OFCCP, which is a really small agency, they say they're understaffed. It's going to take them some time. They're going through those 4,000 objections, and they're going to make a decision about whether or not to release data from those remaining firms. I think they said around September, so in the next few months. And then on an ongoing basis, it's not really clear what's going to happen for 2021 and beyond data. But yeah, for those 19,000 firms, it's now available, and it's not all years for every firm. Some of them weren't contractors for every year. Some of them didn't meet the threshold for reporting, but I think it's about 50-something thousand years, individual reports from over 19,000 firms are available through that OFCCP portal.
Excellent. And Josh, would you mind just stop sharing your screen?
Yeah, I actually lost my toolbar. So
No worries.
I'm trying to figure out how to get it back so I can stop sharing.
Stop. I think I figured it out. There we go. Amber had two more questions for you. Sorry, Amber and then Julie. So Amber said, hey, Amber, good to see you. Did you want to ask the second question here? You see, she's working on the audio, but we can't hear you yet, Amber.
My mic was up. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
Can you confirm if if the findings of these public EEO-1 reports are all from the OFCCP website?
So there's about 19,000 companies that the data is reported through there. There's a bunch that are reported through this other Illinois state portal. And then for the rest of them, they're posted on usually corporate sites that we just gather and find ourselves. And so
can I ask a follow-up for that one? Like, how do you go to find those? Like, I know it's like a lot of scraping because they're in annual reports or like DNI reports. Like, how do you go about getting those reports?
For historical reports, it's a lot of investigative work. A lot of those reports no longer exist. So it's trying to track down through the Internet Archive or through other sources of that information. So for example, like Apple's 2014 EEO-1 report's no longer on their site. But on an ongoing basis, yeah, we have a lot of tools which kind of alert us if there's something new. So we kind of like track sites where we expect something might show up, and we're doing a lot of manual checking to see, like, is there something new? We're also engaging with every Russell 1000 company that hasn't published to see, did we miss it? Did you publish it somewhere we didn't find it? Or do you expect to publish it in the future? And also just to make sure we stay on top of everything. So it's a combination of manual checking, engagement, and kind of like tools that ping us when there's something new.
Okay, that makes sense. And the tools are like a crowd job, something like that.
We use kind of like website ping tools where you can kind of like take a snapshot of a website every day, and if something changes. So we do that for for all of our reporting. So we try to stay on top of any new ESG, DEI, human capital reporting. So we kind of, we pick the three to five sites for a company that we expect something would be reported, and just, check if anything changes.
Perfect.
And then we also just manually check for all the companies in our coverage whether we're missing anything.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You got it. If you would like to see more of that in depth, you can always request a demo. We'd be happy to just take you through the platform itself to show you what we're collecting and how we're collecting it.
Yes, that would be great.
Of course, of course. Julie, we got another question from you. My understanding is the EEO-1 data was made public from 2016 to 2020. Is that correct?
That's correct, because the original FOIA request, I believe, was made in 2018 and was updated in one of the court cases. And the decision was handed down, I believe, before the 2021 data was available. So that's correct. It's 2016 through 2020. So again, I don't know what's going to happen with 2021 and beyond, what the expectation is for the OFCCP to just release it for all the companies that didn't object on an ongoing basis, or if it's going to take another request from a journalist or some other organization to get more recent data.
Great. We have any other questions from the audience, either around the EEO-1 or what we're doing with that data? Maybe, Josh, it might be helpful to hear a little bit more about how folks that we're working with are using and utilizing that EEO-1 data.
Yeah, I mean, transparency is the first step, and unfortunately, in the DEI and HCM space, it's really just about getting people to disclose a lot more granular information, so it's available for benchmarking to see where companies are, where they've gone over time, and what good or great looks like. I think because there hasn't been enough data available in the past, there hasn't been enough research into what this actually means. Does more diversity at certain levels of the company correlate with better performance being any sort of financial performance, or lower turnover, or better, ratings, or, better management of people in general, in terms of other second order metrics. I think because of all the data that's now available, there's going to be a lot of research ongoing. There was a study that we participated in last year with As You Sow and some PhD, some academics from Cal that ran a study, but there was only a couple of years of data available. I think, again, with all this data available and with the assumption that there's going to be ongoing data available, I think there's going to be a great body of work that's going to come out of this. And I think it's going to take more than just representation data. The next push from an engagement and stewardship standpoint is moving beyond just representation to the levers companies can pull to affect those metrics: hiring, promotion, turnover data for those same groups. So broken down into those EEOC groups to really see, okay, is a company, if they're doing well, what are they doing? Is it are they hiring externally? Are they moving people through the company and promoting them up internally? Are they doing a great job of retaining top talent? And so that's kind of the next push, as well as pay equity data. The government actually started collecting, beyond just the representation data, pay bands for those same EEO groups back a few years ago. But that effort was stopped by another administration, so unfortunately it never came to light. But being able to see not just the representation, but what those people are being paid and the disparity in pay in those different groups, I think is what a lot of stakeholders are pushing for. But again, the biggest problem is just the lack of a standard of what should be reported, how it should be reported, so that it can be compared across groups. And that's why it's made it so hard to really know, what is this, how do I make sense of this and really say, this is what great is and this is where I want to get to. But again, the more information that's being reported, we've seen, the ball's rolling downhill, and the amount of granularity and reporting from companies has just expanded a huge amount. But again, companies, are free to disclose it how and where they want, and it might not be easy to compare, across companies and industries.
Josh, we have one more question in the chat here.
Yep.
Graham Sinclair, thanks for the session. Question: this data is not audited? Question mark. So how much do you trust it? Are the penalties? What are the penalties? And has anyone run some kind of verification check?
It's not audited. It is certified by the EEOC. So there's a process where they put out guidance, for instance, on how to classify the job categories. And again, I mentioned there's a lot of wiggle room. So in the financial services industry, I'm going to pick a couple of examples. I believe Citigroup has 50 or so people at their top level, and Bank of America has 3,000 or so people at their top level, the top executive level. And so there's a lot of wiggle room with how to classify an executive. With the self-identification data, people are self-identifying their gender and their race and ethnicity. People can choose not to disclose. And I think there's guidance where whoever's responsible for this reporting is supposed to do their best to place somebody in a category. And if they can't, they're just not included. But again, each company is responsible for this internal reporting. And I think the EEOC is really just counting because it's being done on a site basis. So from different offices, and there's different ways it needs to be reported. But no, it's still up to each company to gather this data and report it. I think it's the same thing with all ESG reporting. A lot of it most of it's not audited. If it is, it's being done by one of the big consulting auditing firms, but it's still, they're mostly reliant on the way the company is gathering the data internally and the way that they're classifying things. So it's kind of the same thing. How much do I trust it? Again, there's definitely some caveats with the way it's being, the decision-making around how to classify people, but overall, I think it's the best tool we have to be able to look at firms over time and then also be able to compare companies across industries, geographies, with the understanding it's not perfect. There's drawbacks, and it's not, take it with a grain of salt, but also, again, I think it's pretty good. It's not great, but it's pretty good.
Jalen, we got a question from Jalen. Would you consider EEO-1 reports that have certain job categories removed due to low or non-existent representation to be a full and comprehensive report?
In general, we only consider it full disclosure if they actually disclose exactly what they disclose to the government. So, as an example, Truist Financial discloses the top 3 levels, and then they say all other, which includes bundles together sales and admin, which is roughly half their workforce. So we wouldn't consider that full disclosure. But at the same time, Airbnb, for one of their categories, they don't give the details, and they say it's due to privacy reasons because there's, I think, 7 people in that category. And in some of the individual race and ethnicity categories, there's 1 or 2 people. So I think that, for privacy reasons, I think that's okay. I would still consider that full disclosure. But basically, it's only if it's what's being reported to the government in full would we consider it full disclosure.
Josh, you mentioned a couple, but because of the limitations on EEO-1, you're welcome, Jalen. Because of those limitations on EEO-1, what other sources can people rely on for clear and reliable data from companies?
I think most companies are not using this EEO-1 data. It's archaic in the structure. These job categories are from a long time ago, and most companies say, this isn't how we think of our company, this isn't how we run our company, and we don't actually use this data internally. And so, a lot of them are supplementing it with their own self-reported data in terms of how they think of their company, what's important to them based on their program and their goals and what they want to accomplish. I think the best I've seen is a company like Ford, which actually takes the EEO-1 and produces a supplement with the exact same data, but based on their own organization of how they run their company. So Ford's a heavily unionized company, and basically there's union and non-union employees, and then they break down the non-union into different levels of management. I think that's great. There's other companies which do something similar, like Capital One says, here's our EEO-1, and here's, the top level is what we consider, VP and above, and the next level is this. And so, it'd be great if they can kind of make it clear, this is how we think of our company here, here's how it compares to this report. But I think in general, it's much more about what's important to our company, what do we feel like is going to help us, build our business, what's our program, what's our strategy, what are our goals, and how are we doing against our goals. And so, ideally we have apples to apples data that we can compare across every company, but it's really about looking at a company and really on more of a sector basis, I think is ideal. So I think most companies think about, like Ford, they're thinking about, in our industry, this is what things look like, this is what's important. And I think that's kind of what the standards are moving towards, whether you look at the SASB or whatever the new framework is going to look like. It's more based on sector, and it's also based on financial materiality. So really thinking about what is important to investors and what's going to actually be tied to financial performance is really what I think long-term what people are going to care about. So again, it's going to take years for standards to be established and companies to start following them, or new laws, regulations, mandates to be passed. In the meantime, the EEO-1, along with the self-reported data that's starting to coalesce along roughly the lines of, representation by different categories and job levels, which are relatively standard by industry. Kind of these, hiring, promotion, turnover rates, pay equity, in terms of the quantitative data, and then a lot of the programs and policies underlying this, which companies feel like, are what are actually attracting people, retaining people, and which helps them stand out beyond just here's our workforce broken down in all these different ways. It's more about why somebody wants to come work here and stay here, and how they're helping to grow their business. But again, the EEO-1 is going to serve as this standard way of measuring representation across all these companies and industries. And the more data we have, the bigger the body of research is going to come out. That's going to help us understand what this means and how companies can use it to make decisions, make changes, things like that.
Right. Curious to hear more from our audience. Is there any, oh, there you go, Meredith. Any thoughts on how we might access companies with a higher percentage of contractor use?
It's a great question. I know there's not a lot of data reporting around kind of the breakdown of employees and contractors. It's something we're looking into and we're trying to figure out. I know there's some of the big tech companies, they have a big shadow workforce, or a big workforce of contractors, which oftentimes is bigger than their full-time employee, their full-time workforce. I don't know of any great way to do that now, other than what the company puts out there. We have some tools we're looking into, which might help there, but right now I don't know of a good way to be able to see which of these companies has a high percentage of contractors versus employees.
Cool. And curious to hear from our audience, are there any other pain points around the use of this EEO-1, normalizing for apples to apples comparisons, or even just implementation in your own practices that are top of mind for you? We'd love to hear more from you on that. We're all in this together to figure out how to normalize this data, right? So just curious to hear.
Oh, thank you. I'm trying to see, so who are your main customer, your clients would you say investors?
Our main clients right now are investors. They're using it for engagement and stewardship, going into the kind of setting expectations. So now that shareholder season is winding down, a look back at this past season looking at where companies are in terms of transparency and what's expected for next year and what can we push for next year, and going into those individual engagements saying, here's what we want, here's our data to back it up, here's what your peers are doing, and pushing for it, as well as starting to integrate this information into their investment decisions. Again, it's so hard because there's a lot of gaps and it's hard to normalize, but especially for active managers or stock pickers, they can really use this to supplement a lot of the other information they have and really understand a company's culture and the way they manage their people, and it's starting to help them go deeper than what was available before. Big professional services firms that are advising Fortune 1000 companies are using it to help their clients benchmark, help understand kind of best practices and best-in-class companies that are doing certain things well, and kind of a starting point in building a program or focusing on certain issues. And we're starting to work with the companies themselves. Again, they're sitting on the other side of the table of those investors, helping them understand, like, where are we? So benchmarking, where are we? How do we compare to our peers? Who's doing great? How do we go into these engagements, really well armed, so that we can either push back or we can say, here's what we're doing, and so those are our main, those are the main use cases and they're, our main clients today.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Long term, we want to help a lot of other stakeholders just use information to make better decisions. It could be an HR manager, a DEI leader, it could be a vendor that wants to work with a company, it could be a job seeker. So we want to be able to find more information, bring it all together, normalize it as best as possible, and then make it available so that you can compare companies, compare industries, and really get a deep dive into something really niche or specific to what's important to you, but also kind of high level, look at a company and compare to its peers overall.
Yeah, because I feel like that's the pain point, right? Trying to figure out what's good or great. So that's why I was like, I wonder if the investors are going to your, coming to you and saying, hey, can you tell me what's the benchmark? Can you tell me what looks good, what looks great? So I was wondering, I know you mentioned SASB earlier. Are you like working with those standard setters to trying to figure out that benchmark?
Right now we're, I think everyone is pushing for disclosure and transparency. Unfortunately, nobody knows what's really meaningful yet, or what, I know there's a lot of scores out there, but I don't think anyone can say, here's a score for your culture, your human capital, and it's correlated with any sort of performance. We'd love to be able to get there, but for now it's more just about benchmarking, transparency and disclosure, and helping point out leaders and laggards in certain areas. I think it'll be interesting to see what comes out of some of the standards bodies. There's always going to be, there's not going to be full coverage where every company is reporting according to some standard unless it's mandated. I think, Europe's a little bit farther ahead in mandating certain things and making it more structured. I think whenever the SEC does come out with rules, there probably will be more structure. Hopefully it will include things like contractors versus employees, full-time, part-time, things like that, which I think it probably will. I think things like that are probably more indicative or going to be more tied to financial performance rather than some of these, more like measures of, people's characteristics. But it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think the more data we have, the bigger historical data set we have, the more that we can really analyze this and start to say, like, what's meaningful and what matters, and what correlates with performance and what great looks like. I think the more we can also triangulate data, looking at employee ratings and other things that can help like what companies people love working for, what companies, what turnover rates and things like that. The more data we have, the more we can really start to say, this is great, or these are the parameters or characteristics of a company that is great, and then start to kind of like drill down and say, okay, we can rank or rate some company based on these characteristics and help people understand that. I don't think we're there yet. We'd love to get there.
We're big on transparency, and I think.
Thank you.
I mean, for now, the biggest thing that we're providing is this information is hard to find. It's very, it could be in a 300-page PDF report. It could be some data that's on our website. It's hard to organize. It's hard to normalize. And then it's hard to build tools to allow people to use it in a way that kind of fits into their day-to-day. So that's what we're focused on right now. And again, longer term, we'd love to be able to say, here's what it means, and here's how you can use it to make an investment decision, build a product, things like that.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank
Quick
you so
question.
much.
Go for it, John.
So quick question, Josh. In your coding, do you have a sort of a column, so to speak, for how easy it was to get hold of the information? I'm thinking about some firms might put it very prominently and easy to access versus burying it down there. I'm just curious if that's something you have coded up.
No, we don't. But it's interesting. There are some companies that, and it's more about this type of reporting in general. There are companies that have, 5 different places where they report information about, ESG, CSR, their workforce in general. There are companies which make this sort of reporting very prominent, and it's easy to find, and it's all in one place. And there are some companies which seem to bury it and make it impossible to find. But no, we don't have any sort of tracking of who's doing that or how hard it was to find. I'm thinking of Nike offhand. Nike, there was a shareholder proposal filed to get Nike to release their EEO-1 data. I don't remember who filed the proposal, and I think the proposal was withdrawn after they agreed to do it. And they put a link on the bottom of one of their pages of their impact reporting that was almost impossible to find. And we only found it because we have a tool that pings us when something changes, and it was just, there wasn't a link there before, and now there was a link. But Berkshire Hathaway, the same thing. There was a shareholder proposal filed. The proposal was actually voted down, but they agreed to file it. And just one day there was a new PDF on their site, and we only found it through a Google image search, actually, which is one of the ways we find things too. So, I don't know if I don't know the reasoning that goes into that, but no, it is interesting to see the different ways companies think about this. There are companies that'll talk about it in their their press release and say we now disclose EEO-1 data, and or we've been Merck says we've been disclosing EEO-1 data for 20 years or something like that. And then there's companies which again, unless we get pinged, we have these manual checks, we use things like image search. There's a lot of times where we would miss it unless we were really trying to find it.
Fantastic. We're getting towards the end of our time here. Just wanted to flag to folks as you're thinking about your last questions here. We're going to take this recording. We're going to post it online. We'll make sure to get this information out to you as well. So you have the recording. You'll have a couple of these links that we've also talked about to give you some resources. Would love to partner with folks on this, right? It kind of takes a village to pull all this together. So if you're interested in partnering with us, if you're interested in seeing more of our product itself, getting a demo, we'll send a link out to request a demo to look at our data set itself. Yeah, all that information will be in your inbox pretty shortly after, okay?
Perfect. Thank you so much. This was very informative.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Any lingering questions while we're still on the line here?
I have just one crazy suggestion here. Josh, the way you nicely described the EEO-1 document, its history, etc., it's going to sound a little bit like a professor giving someone a homework assignment. But if there's a way to write that up in a 10 or 20 page document, I think that would be incredibly informative to people, many sort of zones who would have an interest in the EEO-1 data. What is the history? What sort of, when did data come out? Little visuals on that kind of thing. Not just the statistics, but the 25, 30 years or more of history. That would be fascinating. And you obviously know tons about this. You're the expert, and your colleagues there. That would be wonderful to have that kind of documentation.
That's good to hear. Yeah, I was just talking to Dan a little bit about this before the call, just kind of giving him some of the history. And what's interesting in general is the government tends to be decades behind in terms of catching up. So, some of this stuff is archaic, and I was saying that the Census Bureau was using some categorizations of races and ethnicities up until the 80s that I can't even repeat out loud. But yeah, I was saying that I don't know the history, but I think it was the late 90s where a bunch of companies actually started making this public and disclosing it in reporting. And then for whatever reason, after a few years, they just stopped. And a lot of companies just stopped publishing sustainability reporting in general. So I don't know, it's kind of an ebb and flow. Yeah, I'd be happy to start to put together all the research and background and history. Yeah, I think it would be interesting. And just for everyone else, we'd love to make this data available to other academics. We're working with John because he's starting to look into a lot of this data. So we're happy to license this data for free to academics to be able to run their own analysis and use it in whatever ways they can. But yeah, that'd be really interesting to put together like a full history and background of the EEO-1.
Well, you have a couple of months from the professor to do the assignment. So thank you. Appreciate your interest and think about it.
We won't be asking for extensions, promise. One last very juicy question here from Graham. Thank you so much for this. Any view on anti-ESG state level attacks looking to shut down transparency and reporting window on everything, especially DEI?
You know, it's an interesting time with all the pushback and all the anti-ESG. It's interesting because you're not hearing pushback from the companies themselves. I think the companies realize this is where we're going. And I know there's been some hearings in Congress the last few days. And I think the bottom line is, from my perspective, whatever you call it, and I know ESG is not well defined and there's a lot of different terms, but ESG is really just data. And the more information that investors have, the better decisions they can make. And that doesn't mean we should just open the floodgates and say every company has to report everything. But I think, whether it's mandated or not, we are moving towards a world where every company is disclosing a lot more information certainly in this space about people. I think it's becoming really important to the next generation, the companies they work for. That's another stakeholder we didn't discuss, but employees are really asking for a lot of this information or demanding that companies do a lot more, whether it's talking about culture and working from home and different resources being made available, or really having a voice. So, I don't think politics is going to affect the long-term trajectory of more transparency and more granularity. I think it will kind of slow the explosive growth of the productization of ESG and the commercialization of it. And there's always going to be this back and forth in terms of what political party is in power and what administration is running things in terms of what's being mandated and what the government is doing. But again, I think it's because it's coming from a lot of different stakeholders and the employees and the companies themselves realize that this is really important, that the trend is just going to continue.
That's a great perspective.
They might tone down some of their messaging. We talked to a company recently. I'm not going to mention the company that's been in the crosshairs of some politicians, and they said, "Listen, this is really important to us internally, but we're being much more cautious about how we communicate this externally, and how it could affect our business negatively if we say or do certain things." So I think there'll be more caution. There'll be a lot more thought put into the communication and storytelling around this information, but I don't think it's going to change, again, in terms of the trend we've seen in terms of more transparency and more reporting.
That's reassuring words, Josh. I appreciate the positive outlook. We're nearing the end of our time here. If there's any remaining thoughts, we'd love to hear them. Of course, you could email us directly. I'll throw my contact into the chat here. And of course, you'll get an email from me shortly after. But would love to stay in contact. I'm going to sign up in just a minute. Thank you all for joining. And again, look at for that email from me. Thank you, Josh, for your time and your presentation. Really well put together. And thank you for everyone's time. We'll see you soon.